Well, we've chewed up our food. We've turned it into a bolus. It's chewed up, masticated. It's mixed with saliva, which is breaking down the amylose a little bit. And we've swallowed it. It's been carried by paracelsus down the esophagus, bypassing the trachea, thanks to the epiglottis. And now it's moving to the sphincter at the top of our stomach, which opens up and lets food in. Now, the stomach itself is part of the gastrovascular cavity. It's a structure that secretes gastric juice, which has a pH of about 2. And if you recall, that's pretty acidic. Inside is hydrochloric acid, HCl, and pepsin. Pepsin is an enzyme that helps to break down proteins. It breaks peptide bonds between certain proteins, pepsin. Okay. In fact, that's where the name Pepsi comes from, because it was supposed to be a medicine that helped you digest things, I guess. Now, within your stomach, there are cells called parietal cells. You want to write those down. They are cells that secrete hydrogen and chloride ions into the stomach, creating hydrochloric acid. So they're responsible for the low pH. Meanwhile, there are chief cells, and chief cells secrete a substance called pepsinogen. And I want to show you this word pepsinogen. Notice it's got the word pepsin in it, right? And then ogen, gen as in Genesis or beginning. So this is the beginning of pepsin. And so it's a protein that's not quite the right shape yet, but when it hits hydrochloric acid, it becomes pepsin. It gives rise to pepsin. It changes shape in response to that highly acidic environment becoming pepsin. Meanwhile, the stomach itself can be damaged by its own secretion, so it has a mucus lining that's replaced quite frequently. So it secretes this mucus lining, and then it replaces it. It's kind of like a gasket, a liner that prevents the stomach from damaging itself with its own digestive juices. Meanwhile, very few things are actually absorbed by the stomach. I think some water can pass through the stomach wall into the blood, and I think I've read that aspirin can as well. Like if you swallow an aspirin, it can pass through the stomach lining into the blood. But most things have to leave the stomach now to move on. But another big misconception is that the stomach people often think the stomach is the main source of digestion, but in reality, the stomach doesn't do a lot of digestion of anything except for really proteins. So we don't have much digestion of carbohydrates or fats in this organ. So what it does is that highly acidic stomach acid denatures proteins. It makes them unravel, once again increasing their surface area. And then pepsin can get in there and cut those peptide bonds holding the amino acids together. So it hits the acid, unfurls and then we denature the enzyme basically, or the proteins, and we go in and we cut them with pepsin. But meanwhile, we don't digest all the proteins here. We just get some of them, and really carbohydrates and fats are not really being digested by the stomach. Here's a cross-section of some stomach tissue. You can see these pits in the stomach surface. These are called gastric pits, and they contain various cells. They have mucus cells that secrete the mucus lining of the stomach. They also contain those chief cells and those parietal cells. Chief cells secrete pepsinogen, and parietal cells secrete essentially hydrochloric acid. And pepsinogen hits that hydrochloric acid and becomes pepsin. And now it's ready to digest whatever proteins enter the stomach. All right, so now food's going to leave out the bottom of the sphincter in the stomach, and it's going to enter into the small intestine. The duodenum is the beginning of the small intestine. And here is where several of the accessory organs come into play. So let's introduce those accessory organs. So remember, these are organs that food does not actually go through, but they secrete things into the digestive tract, okay? So the pancreas. The pancreas secretes pancreatic fluid into the duodenum, and it does that through the pancreatic duct, okay? So pancreatic fluid. Pancreatic fluid includes various enzymes such as trypsin and chymotrypsin. Trypsin and chymotrypsin break down proteins into smaller polypeptide. So we continue the breakage of those things that we started in the stomach. By the way, the food as it leaves the stomach that's now been partially digested is called chyme, hence this word chymotrypsin. You can see that word there. So if you see the word chyme, that food bolus is now called chyme. It's been partially digested. All right, pancreatic amylase. This is a secretion of the pancreas that breaks down long polysaccharides into smaller sugars. And there's lipase in here. Lipase breaks down lipids. It breaks down fats into smaller components, like free fatty acids and monoglycerides. Another thing that's in pancreatic fluid is bicarbonate. Bicarbonate neutralizes chyme, the acidic chyme from the stomach, allowing it to become closer to neutral or even slightly basic as it leaves the stomach. Because it's covered in stomach acid, you have to neutralize it. And just to point out, it's one of the things that's regulating when these different things occur is, of course, the nervous system is involved, but also the endocrine system that we talked about briefly in the other previous chapter there. Another thing that the pancreas does is it secretes glucagon and insulin. Now, these are not directly related to pancreatic fluid. These are secreted into the bloodstream. Glucagon helps us to release sugars, stored sugars from our cells into the blood. And insulin, of course, allows us to bring sugar out of our blood into our cells. And when that system is damaged, we end up with type 1 or type 2 diabetes. And you can read about that, and I ask that you do read about that in your textbook for this chapter. Okay, accessory organs. Other accessory organs include the liver. This is your largest internal organ. It's a big organ, and it's one of its jobs. It's got a lot of jobs, but one of its jobs is that it secretes something known as bile. Bile includes bile pigments and bile salts. Bile pigments are kind of waste products. They're leftover blood cells and things. And bile salts are for the emulsification of fats. Emulsifiers are things like, think of soap as an emulsifier. They stick to fats, which are nonpolar, but they have the emulsifier has a polar side and a nonpolar side. And so if you cover a fat in an emulsifier, it can then also mix with water because the emulsifier has a polar side and a nonpolar side to it. So, almost like a phospholipid. You'd have a polar part. Well, I guess I can't draw here. You'd have a polar part and a nonpolar part. The polar part mixes with water. The nonpolar end sticks to fats. Another accessory organ that we need to mention is the gallbladder. It receives the bile from the liver, and it stores it and concentrates it. And then what happens is if fatty food enters into the duodenum, the beginning of the small intestine, the gallbladder will contract, squirting bile into the intestine through the bile duct. And so what that does is it allows for those fats to be better absorbed by the body rather than passing through. So they allow us to absorb fats into our body. So here's an image of the gallbladder, the liver. So you can see the liver produces bile. It's stored in the gallbladder, and then there's a bile duct then that leaves here. It goes down into the duodenum, the beginning of the small intestine. And then here's the pancreas. The pancreas also plumbs into the small intestine. The pancreatic duct is where all that good stuff flows into the intestine. And also in the pancreas are beta cells and alpha cells. So alpha cells in the pancreas secrete glucagon, and beta cells produce insulin. And if you have type 1 diabetes, your immune system, for whatever reason, attacks and destroys beta cells. Whereas if you have type 2 diabetes, what happens is, if you remember our discussion of cell communication, when you have reception, transduction, things like that, your cell stops responding to insulin. So either reception isn't working right or transduction isn't working right, so you don't respond to insulin very well. So it's a different kind of problem. So either way, the pancreas is a very important organ for those reasons. All right, so when we pick up from there, I want to talk to you more about what goes on in the small intestine.